Hello, this is the video, the continuation of the series of videos for public law revision for the year 2020. This video will be addressing the chapter of primary legislation and delegated legislation. Now, this is a chapter that, if you looked at the first video I did, I told you is one of those chapters that, if you like, is optional, in inverted commas, right? Optional. I think it's an easy chapter to do. It's very straightforward. The arguments are pretty clear, and the type of questions that they can ask is fairly clear as well. So very quickly, I know in your subject guide it is divided into two chapters, but it is rare that delegated legislation will come out as a question on its own. Has it come out on its own? Yes, but it is rare, right? It is usually primary legislation or primary legislation and delegated legislation in one question, right? Because I think there is really not enough to write for a full question on delegated legislation alone. But in any way, you should be prepared either way with all the arguments and things like that. Let's look at the most recent questions on this area. So if you look at your seminar pack, I think there was a question in 2019, right? So that's the question we'll be addressing. 2019 Zone B question 4, right? 2019 Zone B question 4, right? Let's take a look at the question. The question reads, discuss the various ways that Parliament scrutinizes the government and critically assess the effectiveness of Parliament's role in the legislative process. So this actually is a question on Parliament, number one. So which means when they don't use the word specifically House of Commons or House of Lords, then and they've used the word Parliament, then please make sure you discuss both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. By the way, you would have received a handout for this question as well. So please make sure you have the handout with you as this video goes along. So again, in analyzing the question, so they say discuss the various ways that Parliament scrutinizes the government. So that's important. Please talk about the House of Lords. Please talk about the House of Commons as well. Now, naturally, your House of Commons discussion is going to be more than the House of Lords. Don't worry about that. You don't have to have equal time for both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. It's not realistic. There are far more arguments in the House of Commons than there are in the House of Lords. So do that. And then, but what are they asking you to evaluate, right? So the question says, discuss the various ways that Parliament scrutinizes the government and critically assess the effectiveness of Parliament's role in the legislative process. So this, by the way, is a very classic traditional question, because they are asking, how does Parliament do its two main roles? And its two main roles are making law, so that's the legislative process, and keeping an eye on the government, that's scrutiny of the government, right? So this is a all-encompassing type of question, right? So if you can prepare for a question like this and make sure you have enough information, sometimes questions can ask you just on one aspect, the effectiveness of Parliament's role in the legislative process maybe. So as much as you're preparing for this question, also make sure you prepare enough for each individual aspect. So sometimes the question may ask the effectiveness of the House of Commons role in the legislative process. Very, very specific. Not like this question. This question is asking you about the House of Commons and the House of Lords role in the lawmaking process and scrutiny of the government. So there is really a lot to write here. Honestly, your struggle is going to be whether you can put down everything, or your struggle is going to be whether what you need to cut out from the information that you have read throughout the academic year. Right? So as usual, I am very reluctant to simply just read out an answer that I have prepared to you. I believe that you can do that. But so what we are going to do is we are just going to be going through the main points of the answer, and you can take a look at the answer that I've given you and check on that accordingly, right? So in my introduction, obviously, I'm going to talk about Parliament. I'm going to explain what is Parliament in the UK. So I say in the UK, Parliament is bicameral. It's made up of two houses, the House of Commons, House of Lords. I give a little bit of background into the House of Commons and the House of Lords. I say that the House of Lords is the less powerful house, if you like, right? And that's true, right? The House of Lords is the less powerful house. That's only because the House of Commons is an elected house, right? And because the House of Commons is an elected house, it is only natural that the House of Lords, which is an appointed house, not an elected house, an appointed house, should have less power. The elected house will have the mandate of the people, and naturally they will have more power. So a little bit of an introduction, a bit of the roles, and explaining the statement, right? And then I go straight to the body, right? So I have decided to look at the lawmaking process first, right? Why? Because I think there's more to write. So I've put that first, right? I told you in one of the previous videos as well that I sent the old saying of save the best for last should not apply when you are writing for your law exam papers. Put in your best arguments, the ones that you feel you have the most to write on first, and then we move on to the rest, right? So I'm looking at the lawmaking process. So I start with the House of Commons role in the lawmaking process. Well, the entire lawmaking process is somewhat linked, right? So after a bill goes through the House of Commons, it has to go through the House of Lords as well. Or it can also start in the House of Lords and then move on to the House of Commons, right? So don't forget that. I say that so the second paragraph, right? The second paragraph is where I go into the lawmaking process. It begins with the bill being introduced in Parliament for its first reading. So like I said, it can be introduced in either the House of Commons or the House of Lords. It doesn't matter, right? Usually it will be the House of Commons, usually, but it can be the House of Lords. There are many reasons why the government will introduce a bill in the House of Lords. Sometimes it's very tactical, sometimes it's political, right? They introduce a bill in the House of Lords so that the person introducing the bill is not someone who has to stand for elections in the next general election, because members of the Lords are not. So bills that are sometimes seen as controversial, bills that are sometimes seen as something that the politicians don't want to touch, sometimes is sent to the is introduced in the House of Lords. There's always representation from the government in the House of Lords, right? There will always be representation, that means members of the government who are from the House of Lords, and they will take on the role of introducing the bill, right? So anyway, so a bill can begin in the House of Lords or the House of Commons, and the process in the both houses are the same, right? The processes in both houses are the same. So there's the first reading, right? So explain what the first reading is. The first reading is usually what we call a dummy stage, right? This is just where a bill that has been introduced will be read out to all the members of the House of Commons or the House of Lords. There are two types of bills, usually government bills or private member bills. And then, so a government bill obviously is introduced by the government. A private member bill is a bill that was introduced by any member of Parliament who is not part of the government. The vast majority of bills will be government bills, right? Private member bills usually have very little chance of success because they don't have the backing of the government. These bills can either be private member or government. Then there are also further categorizations depending on the substance of the bill, public bills, private bills, or hybrid bills. So a public bill is a bill that affects society as a whole. A private bill affects a small segment of society. So for example, let's say for example an act of parliament that governs lawyers. or an act of parliament that governs engineers or something like that, right? This would be an example of private bills because they only affect lawyers or they only affect engineers or doctors or so on and so forth. But a bill that affects the society as a whole, for example, like the Theft Act or the Contracts Act, right? These are what we call public bills. And of course, if it's a little bit of both, we call that a hybrid bill, right? Okay, now after the first reading, right, where the bill is read out in its entirety and usually nothing else happens there, it goes on to the second reading. Now the second reading is where a very general debate takes place, and this debate is done in the house of the entire Parliament, meaning the entire House of Commons or the entire House of Lords will be participating in this debate. This debate is usually not a very technical debate, meaning it doesn't get into the specifics of, section 2, subsection 3 says this or this word says that. It doesn't get into that. This is more of a general debate about the pros and cons of a particular that particular piece of legislation. Now, most importantly, at the second reading is where a vote takes place. Now, this is important because only if the bill survives the vote will the bill be able to continue, right? So at the second reading, there is a vote. If the bill is defeated, meaning the bill doesn't get enough votes to go on to the next stage, then the bill is what we call dead, right? A dead bill cannot be reintroduced at the second reading for a second go. It has to be reintroduced again as a brand new bill. Okay, so if it has passed the second reading, the vote, right, then it goes on to the committee stage, right? Now, what happens at the committee stage is where we've got public bill committees. Public bill committees are ad hoc committees that are created for the purposes of scrutinizing the particular act. Now, this is where, ladies and gentlemen, the scrutiny of the bill becomes very detailed and very technical. The role of the Public Bill Committee is to do a very detailed clause-by-clause scrutiny. So their job is to literally read every line and make sure the commas are in the right place, the language is correct. Will it accidentally repeal another bill because of the implied repeal rule? Things like that. Does it comply with European Union legislation? That is what the Public Bill Committee is supposed to do. So after you finish the committee stage, then it moves on into the committee can make amendments. Yes, obviously the committee can make amendments, and the committee can make amendments as long as it does not change dramatically the substance of the bill, right? Because remember, the bill was passed by the entire House of Commons. So a committee of 15 to 50 members of Parliament shouldn't be able to dramatically change the entire meaning of the entire piece of legislation, right? So they can make amendments, and then these amendments then will be reported back to the House of Commons, and this is what we call the report stage. So all the amendments that have been made by the Public Bill Committee will be reported back to the House of Commons, and then the bill in its new and amended form will be read out to the House of Commons or the House of Lords, and this is called a third reading. During the third reading, there can be amendments, but it must be very minor amendments, right? That can happen. And once it is done, so if this entire process, first reading, second reading, committee stage, report stage, third reading, if it is done in the House of Commons, then what happens is it is now passed on to the House of Lords for them to go through the similar process. If it started off in the House of Lords, then conversely, it will then be passed on to the House of Commons for them to do a similar process. Right? Both houses have a similar process for to make law. Right? Now, once both houses have agreed, now it is not always that both houses will agree with each other. Sometimes when there are issues, the the house, let's say it started off in the House of Commons, then it was sent to the House of Lords. If the House of Lords disagrees with something or another, they can send it back to the House of Lords with their proposed amendments. Then the House of Commons can either accept it and send it back, or disagree and send back a new proposal. So this can go back and forth for a while. And this is unofficially called the ping pong stage, right? So this can happen. Once both houses agree, to the bill, then, ladies and gentlemen, the bill will be sent to the Queen for royal assent. Now, obviously, today there is no more actual act of the Queen signing the bill, but it's still a formality, right? So, royal assent will be granted once both houses have passed. Okay, so this is the legislative process, right? But remember, the question is asking us about the scrutiny of the legislative process. So we need to get into that as soon as possible as well. Now, I think I have sort of summarized the entire legislative process quite succinctly. So at least what I have stated here should be in your answer. I don't think you can get into scrutiny of the legislative process without talking about what is the legislative process itself. Maybe you can shorten this a little bit if you feel this answer is too long. This part can be shortened a little bit, right? So as the bills are being passed, if you continue on with my answer, now I'm getting into the evaluation of the scrutiny bit, right? So the first thing I talk about is the House of Commons exercises a scrutiny function as well. I talk about debates first, right? If we are on the second page, the middle of the second page, and we start off with debates. Yes, debates are a useful mechanism to scrutinize bills because members of Parliament, whether in the House of Lords or the House of Commons, right, will be able to raise issues that are pertinent, that affect their constituents or that affect the country as a whole. And the proponents of the bill, usually the government, will have to defend the bill, right? The government will have to state why, despite these various issues that the members of Parliament have raised, why does the government feel that this piece of legislation needs to go through anyway? So they'll have to defend the bill. It is only in debates such as this where these kinds of issues will come up. Right? So debates are good. And as you can see, there is a debate in the second reading which precedes the vote. So this debate can actually be considered to be very important because it can influence the vote. Right? It may influence the vote. I know all of us are sometimes very jaded and we feel that party whips determine who votes for what. Everybody votes according to their party lines. It's true, right? But there are times when members of Parliament have shown independence, and these debates sometimes may have influenced those members of Parliament, and they have chosen to vote not in strict accordance with what their party tells them to, right? So debates are important. What's the problem with debates, right? There is a general lack of time because Parliament has got a very strict timetable to follow, because if it doesn't stick to a strict timetable, then what's going to happen is the legislative agenda for that particular parliamentary session may not be fulfilled. The bills may not be passed on time, and this is going to be a problem. Right? So sometimes debates are ended quickly. Debates are ended without the opportunity for members of Parliament for members of Parliament to properly flesh out the issues. Right? So that is a problem. Right? Debates can also be curtailed by numerous parliamentary devices, such as the guillotine motion, the closure motion. These are all ways in which the government can sometimes end a debate quickly, and they will always have the strength in numbers in the House of Commons, at least, usually the House of Lords as well, and this compromises on the effectiveness of debates as a method of scrutiny of the legislative process. Next, very quickly, let's move on to, I think, the biggest method, or the most effective method of scrutiny, which is public bill committees, right? Public bill committees, as I explained earlier, and I have explained here again in the answer, ad hoc committees. These are all committees made up of members of parliament, right? Committees made up of members of parliament, numbering between 15 to 50 usually, right? Every single bill will have its own public bill committee. Every single bill will have its own public bill committee, right? So there can be members of parliament sitting in multiple public bill committees. It's not a problem. So why do I say these bills are ad hoc? Because these bills are these committees, right? Why are the public bill committees ad hoc? Because public bill committees are created solely for this reason, to scrutinize that one particular act. And when that act is done, the scrutiny is done, that committee is dissolved. That's why we call it an ad hoc committee. So what's their role, right? Their role is a detailed clause by clause scrutiny of the bill to ensure that there are no mistakes. This is very good, right? Because nowhere else in the entire legislative process, remember the first reading, second reading, report stage, third reading, nowhere else is there this opportunity to have such a detailed scrutiny, right? That is just not there. So this is the opportunity for the public bill committee to properly look at the bill, right, in great detail. They can also give amendments, they can also make amendments, they can also suggest changes to the bill. So this is a good thing, right? So in this sense, the House of Commons and the House of Lords, Parliament in its sense, does scrutinize the bill well, I suppose. But public bill committees also have problems. And what are the problems, right? The first and most obvious problem that I put here right at the bottom of page 2 is the membership of public bill committees, right? A public bill committee must reflect the composition of the House of Commons or the House of Lords, which means, and this is an acute problem in the House of Commons, the government of the day has the majority in the House of Commons. And because your public bill committee must reflect the composition of the House of Commons, naturally the public bill committee will have a majority from the party that is forming the government, and they will be government supporters. So imagine this. The government is introducing the bill in Parliament. Parliament is supposed to scrutinize the bill. The Public Bill Committee is supposed to do a detailed scrutiny of the bill. But the Public Bill Committee is made up of, the majority of the Public Bill Committee will be made up of members of Parliament who support the government. This is a problem, right? Arguably, a lot of people say, but wait, members of Parliament can exercise their own free will. Members of Parliament can vote however they want to. All of this is true. All of this is true, obviously, but the reality is, the harsh reality is, members of Parliament usually vote in accordance to what their party tells them to. So this could be a serious problem here, right? Any members of the opposition will definitely be in the Public Bill Committee as well, but any dissenting voice from the members of the opposition will quite quickly be stifled, because the majority come from the government party. That's the problem. Another issue is that the Public Bill Committee has no power to call for persons or paper. This is very interesting. A Public Bill Committee cannot call for someone to advise them about a particular bill. Members of Parliament have to do their own research. a public bill committee cannot call for a public hearing and invite an expert on a particular area to brief them. They can't do that, right? The problem here is members of parliament don't have expertise on every single area that parliament makes law on. Parliament makes law on a variety of areas, sometimes very specialized areas as well. And if a member of parliament does not understand that particular area, apparently he can't even call for an expert in the area to come and brief him. This is going to be a problem, isn't it, right? So in that sense, this may reduce the effectiveness of public bill committees as well. Right? So this is another problem. Now, ladies and gentlemen, at this point, when you read your notes or a textbook, you may have noticed that there are other issues with public bill committees and other issues with the House of Commons or whatever. But remember, this question is asking us a lot of things. So I've had to make some decisions as to what to leave in, what to not leave in. Please remember that. And as usual, this cliche, it's an incredible cliche, but I'm still going to use it. Quality is better than quantity. So I've just picked 2 or 3 points which I think I have discussed in some detail a little bit, as opposed to just merely putting down in almost point form or 1 or 2 sentences what the problems are and listing down way more problems, right? I don't think that's a good way to go about the answer. So you need to be sure which points you want to use, which points you want to drop, depending on how fast you can write, how much you can write, right? These are very relevant considerations as well. Right after that, if you look at my answer, I get into the House of Lords, right? The House of Lords also plays a scrutiny role. And most of what was said about the House of Commons earlier also applies to the House of Lords. But when it comes to the House of Lords, there are some other interesting issues that we can talk about as well. There are plenty, but I've chosen to talk about these few here. The House of Lords is always seen as having more time to evaluate legislation. Why? Because the members of the House of Lords are not career politicians, or they are ex-politicians usually, right? The politicians are in the House of Commons, right? So which means that they don't have to worry about politics. They don't have to worry about their constituents. They don't have to worry about preparing for the next general election. They can just focus on their role as members of parliament in the House of Lords. And that's important, right? So that's a value of the House of Lords that the House of Lords brings to the legislative scrutiny of the legislative process, right? It is often said that the standard of debates is always better in the House of Lords. Why? It is not that the members of the House of Commons are all stupid. It's very easy to take pot shots at politicians that way, isn't it? But that's not true. The reason why it is said that the House of Lords has got a higher quality of debates is because it's an appointed house. And when it's an appointed house, the leaders of various industries, the leaders of various, not just industries, but various fields, they will be the ones who will be appointed to the House of Lords. So debates in the House of Lords, especially when it's debates in the second reading or the committee stage, debates in the House of Lords are going to be so much richer because there is so much more expertise in the House of Lords, right? So that's a good thing as well. And finally, I've also said the House of Lords is not so tied down by party politics, right? Now, to say that there is no party politics in the House of Lords is not true. There is, right? But members of the House of Lords are not as tied down to party politics. They will be more free to break away from what their party tells them, because the consequences on them are usually not so great. If you are a member of the House of Lords, you're there for life. So what? What can they do? So you usually you usually have a bit more courage to say or do what you think is right. And also there are many crossbenchers. So what is a crossbencher? Crossbenchers are people who don't belong to any political party. They were appointed not because of their political affiliation, but because of their contribution and things like that. However, as we all know, the House of Lords also has its problems, mainly with regard to the Parliament Acts and conventions like the Salisbury Convention. These kind of reduce its effectiveness in scrutinizing the lawmaking process. Now, why do I say that? Because with regard to the Parliament Act, the House of Commons can effectively skip the House of Lords, isn't it? We saw this with the Hunting Act in 2004, and it's been used a couple of times throughout history, right? So that definitely will put a damper on the effectiveness of the House of Lords. But whilst that is true, I think it would be wrong to sort of categorize the House of Lords as just a rubber stamp or a toothless tiger, as some people call it. That's not true. The House of Lords has, in fact, inflicted defeats on the House of Commons. And what do I mean by that? I mean things like when the House of Lords insists on some kind of an amendment to a bill and the House of Commons doesn't want to, the Lords still insist and the House of Commons backs down. Sometimes because political pressure, but sometimes the Commons just has to pick and choose its fights, right? So the House of Lords does play an effective role as well in the scrutiny of the legislative process. Now that in itself, right, can be a full question, ladies and gentlemen. So if you are preparing for this area, make sure you are able to write on just the legislative process itself. The scrutiny of the House of Commons, House of Lords. So this is where you can put in all the other points that you would have seen in your textbook or your notes or things like that. But this question is also asking us on the Parliament's role on scrutiny of the executive. So yeah, you're right. It is a lot to write, right? So scrutiny of the executive by Parliament, right? I do say that Parliament does play a very, very important role, especially with the Westminster style Parliament that the UK has, where your members of government are fused with Parliament, right? The separation of powers is not so clear there. So because your members of government sit in Parliament, it is important that Parliament is able to keep an eye on the executive. That's part of the efficient secret, if you like, right, of the UK's constitution. The fact that the people's representatives, Parliament, members of Parliament are able to scrutinize and keep an eye on the government. But how effective are they, right? So there are effectively three ways, right? Three ways I think that Parliament scrutinizes the executive, the government, which is select committees, which is what I've written the most about. And then you have question time, and then also finally you have backbenchers, obviously, right? I've chosen not to write too much about backbenchers because they kind of overlap anyway. So I've focused on question time here and select committees, right? So I've explained what is a select committee. A select committee is what we call a permanent committee, as opposed to the ad hoc committee that we saw for public bill committees, right? So a select committee, ladies and gentlemen, is a permanent committee. Permanent meaning it is the same committee will be there for the duration of Parliament, which is 5 years usually, right? So the membership of these committees will be permanent, and they will be there for the entire 5 years. So there are very specific areas of concern in which these committees will be on. So there might be a select committee on defense, a select committee on energy, a select committee on European Union matters, right? So on and so forth, right? There are usually about 20 to 30 select committees in every parliamentary session, right? So select committees are effectively what we can say Parliament's research bodies or Parliament's investigation bodies. Yeah, that's what we can call them. They are made up of members of parliament as well, right? But they will be made up of members of parliament who are not part of government. That's important to know, right? They'll be made up of members of parliament who are not part of government, right? They are an excellent method of scrutiny. So if you're with me, I'm on page 4 now, right? These committees are an excellent method of scrutiny on the executive, as they are able to bring out issues in the open to debate. So I've given some examples of the successes of select committees. So the classic examples that are often quoted is the Salmonella affair, which I have explained there, right? So if you pick up your textbook or your notes, there are many other such examples as well. Please make sure you can give one or two examples if you like, right? So I have given the Salmonella in the eggs affair, where Edwina Curie, who was the minister, she was being very difficult. She didn't really answer questions, but the mere fact that this came out in a select committee investigation brought that issue out into national prominence, and because of that, steps were taken, and Edwina Curie later on had to leave her career, right, as a member of parliament. Right now, what is the problem with select committees? Pretty much the same problems that plague the public bill committees also are problems that will hamper the select committees, meaning the majority in the select committee will always be members of parliament who support the government, right, or from the government party. And this will always be a bit of a damper in its scrutiny process, isn't it, right? Effectively, the majority in the committee are asked to scrutinize their bosses. That effectively is it, isn't it? Because it is their bosses that are the ministers and the prime minister and the deputy ministers. That doesn't seem like a very effective method of scrutiny. However, please note that don't be too quick to dismiss the effectiveness of select committees, right? The author Barnett says that select committees have had multiple and numerous successes, and this is something that must be noted as well. Even if select committees are sometimes avoided by members of parliament, select committees are when I say avoided, I mean avoided by the ministers. They don't show up for the hearings. Even though all these things happen, if a select committee chooses to do an investigation on a particular issue, that issue will receive such great prominence that usually the government will make the necessary changes, or they will ensure that the right thing is done, because if not, they are going to be embarrassed severely, right? So apart from select committees, question time is another good method of scrutiny. I have spoken about question time a little bit here, so please make sure you can put that down as well, right? So, and what's the biggest problem with question time? Lack of time, right? There just isn't enough time. So, ladies and gentlemen, putting these things all together, how effective is Parliament in scrutinizing the lawmaking process? How effective is Parliament in scrutinizing the government, right? Their role in scrutiny is not perfect. Let's just put it that way. Definitely not perfect. There are plenty of problems. But they do a reasonable job. That's my conclusion, right? They do a reasonable job in upholding the principles of separation of powers and the rule of law. Why? Because they ensure this scrutiny mechanism is absolutely important. Because if not, then the fact that your executive sits in parliament just is potential for a huge amount of abuse. So the fact that the executive sits in parliament, but parliament is able to scrutinize the executive, keep them in place, keep them in check, even though it's not perfect, but they do exercise an important enough role, that's the value of Parliament, right? And also the lawmaking process. Obviously, if Parliament doesn't do a good job in making law, it becomes extra dangerous in the UK. Why? Because the UK practices parliamentary supremacy, isn't it? An act of parliament that comes out is binding. No one can question it, including the courts. So is it perfect? No. But is there room for improvement? Yes. But yes, it's doing a reasonable job. That's my conclusion, right? Okay, so that's the end of that particular question, ladies and gentlemen. Let's look at another question on the same area. So 2019, we just looked at 2019 Zone B, right? So if we look at 2018, ladies and gentlemen, right? 2018, let's look at I believe it's 2018 question 4, Zone A. 2018 question 4, Zone A. Now, it's a very similar type of question. The only reason I want to focus on it is because it's got an element of delegated legislation there. So as you can see, I am going to fast forward through all the other bits and go straight to the delegated legislation part of this answer, right? Because the rest of it is very similar. I'm going to read the question. Question 4, 2018 Zone A, right? Give an account of the lawmaking process in the UK Parliament. Same thing, right? This one is focusing on the lawmaking process only. So whatever you have taken from the previous answer, you can just put it down here exactly. But here there seems to be distinguishing between primary and secondary legislation and evaluate the relative functions and powers of the two houses. Okay, so this is the interesting part that is a little bit different. So here they are only asking you to talk about the lawmaking process. There is no scrutiny of the executive. I told you that there can be some questions like that. But because they are only asking you on the lawmaking process, they seem to be asking you to also talk about primary legislation and secondary legislation. And ladies and gentlemen, secondary legislation is delegated legislation, right? And here also they specifically ask you to evaluate the functions and powers of the two houses. So there is a need to talk about the House of Lords as well. This part is also, I think, a bit overlapping with the earlier question. You can take parts of the earlier question and use it here. So effectively, the only difference in this particular question is the delegated legislation part. So I'm still going to run through this. This is more of a guide only. It's not as full an answer as the previous question I did. Oh, by the way, yeah, you have a second handout, right? Question 4, 2018 Zone A. Right, take that out. This is more of a point form answer that I've done. I'm going to need you to fill in the blanks. But the reason why it's point form is because a lot of what needs to be put in here is already in the previous answer. Just cut it and paste it here, right? So again, an introduction. I talk a little bit about what is Parliament, House of Commons, House of Lords. I explained that one of its main roles is the lawmaking process. That's important, right? Then I go into the lawmaking process. So once again, this is going to be exactly the same as what we did earlier, right, in the 2019 question. So I'm going to skip that bit, but go through the entire lawmaking process, right? First reading, second reading, committee stage, report stage, third reading, explain what happens in every single one of those readings, and then say it goes on to the other house. So the other house meaning if it starts in the House of Commons, it goes on to the House of Lords. If it started in the House of Lords, it goes on to the House of Commons after that, right? You will notice I used the word the ping pong stage there, and I explained what ping pong stage was, right? Okay, so then get into the problems with the process in general, right? So we spoke about this earlier, right? So debates in the second reading. So I've talked about the problems with debates, the problems at the committee stage, meaning about public bill committees, right? These are all various problems, and again, all of this is something that we've already spoken about in the previous question, so I'm going to leave you to that. Now, the next point is what I wanted to talk to you a little bit about. The question makes specific reference to delegated legislation as well. They use the word as secondary legislation, but that's what it means, right? Delegated legislation. So what is delegated legislation, right? So this is the part that you need to put into your answer as well. Delegated legislation is effectively Parliament delegating its lawmaking powers. So what Parliament will do is Parliament will create what is known as the Parent Act. The Parent Act will be a very generic act. Well, not necessarily, right? It can be an act of any type, but in that particular act, it empowers a minister or a government department to make certain rules and regulations that will be left entirely to them. Parliament will not be engaging in the debates, will not be scrutinizing those particular rules that are made by the minister or by the relevant government department. Well, they should be scrutinizing it, but as you will see with the problems, right, the scrutiny sometimes is not so effective. So this is what delegated legislation is. Now, why is delegated legislation necessary, important? Well, simply put, Parliament just doesn't have enough time. Right? Parliament just doesn't have enough time, and also Parliament is also smart enough to leave some details with the experts. Now, what do I mean by this? So this is a common example I always give. Let's say Parliament is passing a law on fishing. Let's say, for example, right? Just a random example, fishing. Parliament wants to pass a law to say that people cannot fish too much. If not, we are going to lose our marine life, and then lots of fish are going to be extinct, things like that. But you see, it just doesn't serve a national purpose for our members of Parliament to sit down and be debating on what species of fish should come under this rule, what species of fish doesn't need to come under this rule, what size can we consider to be an adult so that we can catch, what size is a juvenile so we cannot catch. See, the members of Parliament shouldn't be, well, in inverted commas, wasting their time on these issues. They've got to deal with the national issues, right? But yes, extinction of fish is a national issue. So what Parliament does is Parliament passes a general act, and then that act will empower the minister to, from time to time, come up with specific rules that as to what type of fish can be caught and what type of fish cannot. Now, this is a classic example of leaving it to the people with the experience. Now, you may say, look, the minister doesn't have the experience. You're right, I agree. But the minister is in charge of the Ministry of Fisheries, let's say, for example. And the government department will have experts. And this is why delegated legislation is a good thing, right? So I have put down some points as to why delegated legislation is good, but delegated legislation also has its problems, right? So very quickly, the use of skeleton bills. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a problem, right? Because members of Parliament are there to scrutinize the legislation. Sometimes governments play dirty. They pass a very skeletal bill and they empower the ministers to make all the details later. What then this means is these details will not be scrutinized by the parliamentary scrutiny process. So the members of the opposition will not be able to give their opinions in the debates, in the select committees, or no, not select, in the public bill committees. So sometimes it's a sneaky way for the governments to get things done without Parliament's scrutiny. So that's not good, right? If point number two, if you see the increased power delegated legislation gives to ministers, right? It does make ministers very powerful. If Parliament has empowered them to make some very important pieces of legislation, sometimes ministers may be effectively making law, right? A good example of this would be the Human Rights Act, isn't it? Section 10 of the Human Rights Act. Section 10 of the Human Rights Act empowers the minister to make amendments to a bill if he considers it to be in violation of the ECHR. So the minister can make such amendments, but those amendments don't need to go through the entire parliamentary scrutiny. That's the problem. Depending on how you look at it, right? A lot of people look at it and say that that's a good thing. Why? Because now the minister can make the necessary changes quickly, effectively. They don't have to go through the entire parliamentary process, right? So there are always two ways of looking at it, right? Look at the third problem, the lack of parliamentary time for scrutiny of delegated legislation. This is important. All delegated legislation needs to be reported back to Parliament. Parliament is supposed to scrutinize it, but Parliament obviously has no time. And so the vast majority of these delegated legislations are not scrutinized by Parliament. And it only becomes an issue when someone challenges it in court as being ultra vires. Then it becomes a problem, isn't it, right? But until then, Parliament may well not even know about the existence of this delegated rules or delegated legislation that have been created. The difficulty in raising objections to bills where extensive delegation of powers has been granted. This is linked to the first point, right? When so much power is delegated to the ministers, the members of Parliament can't even object or protest because they don't even know what these ministers are going to be doing, what types of laws these ministers are going to be passing, right? The belief that drafters of the legislation have made errors, flaws in bills or acts which can be corrected. So delegated legislation sometimes is seen to encourage sloppy drafting of legislation because the drafters of the bill say, hey, look, well, let's just do it quickly. If there are any problems, we can sort it out later with delegated legislation, right? The last problem here is the increased use of Henry VIII clauses. Now, Henry VIII clauses are clauses which allow ministers to amend primary legislation with a statutory instrument. So, let's say, for example, there you have passed a particular act, and that act gives the government certain powers. But however, if you include a Henry VIII clause that says that this can be reviewed by the relevant minister every year, then in 1 year's time, that relevant minister can take away that power or increase that power. And this taking away or increasing of the power is not scrutinized by Parliament. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a problem, right? So these are the problems with delegated legislation. Again, I've told you these are point forms, but these are the important salient points. Please put them into the answer and add on to them as well, right? I've also given you why the delegated legislation can be a good thing as well, right? So then after that, conclude. I've spoken about the House of Lords because the question asks for it. You can add on to the House of Lords discussion in this question with the stuff that we discussed in the previous question as well. Right. Okay. So I believe that this is pretty much what the examiner is, the scope of what he's going to ask will be within the ambit of what we've discussed here today. We've managed to discuss both primary legislation as well as delegated legislation. I think it's a good area to do, my opinion, right? Why? Because straightforward, right? Very clear. There's not too much tricks involved in the answer, right? Thank you and good luck.